country. I was an avid waterfowler. I got to hunt, I was stationed in Louisiana, Florida, Kansas, Hawaii. I didn't do any hunting out there, but anyway, I was really privileged to do that. And I got back here and I didn't know anybody to hunt with. None of my friends from high school or college that I knew of hunted. So I ended up walking around the Havre de Grace Decoy Museum, and they had a self-nomination form for the board of directors there. And I figured that might be a good way to meet people to hunt with. Well, little did I know it was going to cost me all this money in decoys years later. But that's really how I got into this. And I started out collecting contemporary stuff. When I got my first pair of Madison Mitchells, good ones, I thought that was it. But as time went on, I got into old decoys. And really what got me into that was being able to hunt on Aberdeen Proving Ground. That place was the location of the most famous duck clubs in the country. And from probably the 1830s on through the early 1900s, when the Army took over that land and turned it into the Proving Ground, 1917. So I got to learn the history of those clubs, and I set a goal for myself that I wanted to get an example of every branded club bird of the clubs that were on the Proving Ground, and it took me about 15 years to do that. But I did it, and that just led to more and more. And I got interested in the great rigs, family rigs from around that area on the Upper Bay, the Puseys and things like that. And I got known as a brand guy, and I do love brands. And I've got my little sign up here. Thanks to the generosity of the clubs, all the clubs, PDCA, Upper Bay Club, Delmarva Club, we were able to start this website, decoybrands.com. And so that's up there, and that's out there as a resource to the community. And you can post birds on it and upload them yourself, and they'll be on there for everyone to enjoy. So you can go to the next slide. I will say that the way I got into hollies was because a lot of those decoys in those clubs were holly decoys, and I didn't even realize how many hollies I had until Chad Trajakis came to me when he wanted to put this Daddy Holly exhibit into the museum, and he said, "You've got one of the best Daddy Holly collections I've ever seen." And I was like, "Really?" I didn't even realize it because I never counted. I've got however many Daddy Hollies, but that's kind of how it started. So. This is really, you guys are all decoy collectors. I did this for folks that had collectors in the audience, but really getting into scholarship, it's ever evolving. And my thing is we should never be afraid to challenge past work. There's icons of the decoy community out there, and we all love them and all that, but they were doing this stuff back before the resources that are available now were available. You've got the internet now, and you've got, genealogical sites, you've got newspapers.com where you can get back into stuff that you would have had to go to the National Archives or the Historical Society to find that stuff, going through microfiche or whatever. So, if somebody says, you might read a book, and there are people that just read the books and take them for, that's the gospel. Well, we're always learning new stuff, and some of that stuff gets challenged, and that's not a cut on those guys that did all that early work, because they did groundbreaking work, but you just find stuff out, and it's so, some people get a little upset when you challenge something, but nobody should. It's like, hey, what do we want to know? We want to know the truth. So I always try to tell new collectors that. And studying decoys will surprise you. I've learned more about local history where I grew up, Baltimore, Harford County, Cecil County, than I would have ever believed I would learn from studying a piece of wood. You get in there, start doing research, and I go down rabbit holes all the time where I'm learning stuff about, where I grew up, street names, who that person was, why that street was named after him. And there's amazing connections to waterfowling and decoys that I've learned through that. Jerry, Giddings Avenue. I've got a decoy with his brand on it.
No way.
Yeah, that was right up the street from where we grew up. Next slide. So John Daddy Holly, the exhibit at the Decoy Museum, if you haven't been up there, I encourage you to go. There's never been a collection in one place of Daddy Holly decoys like this, and we just refreshed it. So if you've been there, there's some birds in there now that were not in there as of yesterday, because I just put the new ones in. And it's just a tremendous display. And now that the Delmarva Club has the display up there, I encourage everyone to get up there. And in 2 weeks, Guy and Dieter will be putting the Harmon collection on exhibit up at the Decoy Museum as a preview to the auction in November. And it's going to be spectacular. And Cooper could probably tell you, because he's probably seen all this stuff. It's great stuff. So I encourage you to get up there. The exhibit's organized into 3 periods: early, middle, and late production. And you know, a lot of this stuff is still guesswork. We don't know 100, we'll never know 100%, but we did our best to try and organize it that way. And it's got great examples of brands from the clubs, you know, the gunning sloops, scows, and yachts, and then the family rigs from around the area. And then there's decoys of questionable attribution. You know, a lot of people attribute decoys to Dick Hallett. Well, we now have the only decoy known that has provenance to Dick Hallett, and Chad put that in there this week. It's one that Mackey collected from Jim Courier, and it had been given to Courier when he was a young man by Dick Hallett. So that's a great bird to see. Next slide. So Daddy Holly 101. Daddy Holly was born in 1818 in Haverty Grace. And as far as we can tell, he probably started making decoys probably in the 1830s, so very early, and continued until his death in 1892. In 1853, he was recognized by John Crider in his book as being one of the premier duck shots on the Upper Bay. And at that time, that was the place to be for duck hunting in this country. It was the absolute mecca. It's believed that he received his nickname because his wife passed away when his kids were very young, and he had to take care of them. And you know, the oldest was probably 6 or 7 at the time, and the daughter, I believe, was about a year old. And in 1866, he purchased his home at 452 Alliance Street, and that's a picture of it right there, and that still stands today, and that's just right up the street from the Decoy Museum. He's considered to be the father of the Harford County style, which is, you know, the carving with the upswept tail and no neck shelf, although there's no hard, fast rule, because he did make some with paddle tails and neck shelf. And a key point, his decoy production was prolific. Ronnie and I were talking about this during everyone's dinner, and like, we have no idea the number of decoys he made, and I'll get into why that's important here in a minute. And there are no known photographs of Daddy Holly. Next slide. So the family, and I'm not going to go into the big genealogical thing that everybody loves, but Daddy Holly, he married Amanda Parsons in 1846, and she died in 1856. William Holly, that's William right there. William was born in 1847. James T. was born in 1849. And John Jr. was born in 1851. And that, I believe, is the only known picture of John Jr., and he's leaning over some fishing nets there. That's down on the waterfront. And Amanda Holly was born in 1853. Next slide. Daddy Holly decoys. So new and even seasoned collectors often have a hard time identifying these decoys and or differentiating them from Jim Holly's decoys. But what's most confounding is the wide variety of styles and heads that you'll find on these things. And there's a number of reasons why that probably is. Next slide. So like I said before, there's never been an opportunity like this exhibit up at the Decoy Museum to examine so many Daddy Holly decoys at one time. And you know, Evans McKinney wrote kind of the seminal book on Upper Bay decoys, and he was the first one that I know of that attempted to document them in terms of measurements and things of that nature, more of a scientific approach. But the problem is, we don't know what his sample size was for those decoys. You know, he may have had 10 or 20 in his collection, maybe. And he identifies some as Dick Hallett's in there, and I'm like, I don't know if that's a Dick Hallett. But at any rate, he did that groundbreaking work. So when we put this exhibit in, I went in and documented some of these early canvasbacks and redheads, 18 canvasbacks and 5 redheads. You know, you hear stuff as a collector over time, like I would always hear about these undersized Daddy Holly decoys, you know, the early ones, you know, the Carroll's Island decoys and all. That's a bunch of stuff. I've measured these decoys, and there was really no difference that was, you know, significant in that group of decoys that I looked at in terms of size. I mean, once in a while you run into something bigger, but I'll get into why some of that could have occurred too a little bit later here in the presentation. So let's look at some of these early examples. Next slide. So here we have this decoy is an original paint. It's worn, but that's pretty rare to find Daddy Holly decoys in original paint. It was because they were used so much. You know, they were used on sink box rigs. They were bringing in sport gunners to hunt, and those sport gunners expected, you know, they were paying a lot of money for that time to do that. So they would repaint these decoys, you know, sometimes twice a season to, you know, to make everything look good for these sport gunners. So finding them with original paint is extremely rare. But the biggest thing you'll notice across all these early decoys is the difference in this side profile and the look of the decoys. You know, you got, you know, this real long upswept tail here. You got kind of a shorter one here. You got a real stubby one there. This one's kind of a medium. Here's a paddle tail. And then here's a kind of a more upright, still a, you know, it's just got a sharper rise to it. But they're all a little bit different. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So that's the thing, when many collectors examine a decoy, they look at the side profile. That's how you put it oftentimes on a shelf, unless you got too many and you got to angle them. But when we look at them, we look at them in a side profile. And that's natural. But that accentuates the variations in style. So if a collector's used to examining contemporary decoys, you know, most of them are lathe turned, so they're very symmetrical. They're very, they all look the same. And I think that's why upper bay decoys get that, well, they all look the same thing. Well, it's because people are looking at this new stuff, not hand-chopped old decoys, because they're very different. And it takes handling a lot of those over time and really getting a feel for those differences to make an accurate attribution. But what do we see with Daddy Holly decoys when we change that perspective to a top-down view? And I call this the common denominator. Next slide. Here's the same 6 decoys. Now look how much the same they are. They're remarkably consistent for hand-chopped decoys. Next slide. So as I said, when we examine them from the top down, we see remarkable consistency. And why? That's because they were likely made with a body pattern that was traced on the top of the block of wood. And even so, if you think about hand chopping out decoys from a block of wood, maintaining that consistency using a hatchet and draw knife, spoke shave, that's tremendous, I think. So I think if you're trying to learn how to differentiate, looking at Daddy Hollies, or what you think might be a Daddy Holly from the top down, is going to give you a better idea of whether it is or is not. Next slide. So let's use the same perspective to differentiate between Daddy Holly and James T. Holly canvasback decoys. So here we have 2 Daddy Hollies, and I have these 2 decoys up here on the table. This one's in original paint that was taken down, and that's kind of that classic style. This is a really different style. I have not seen this style very often, but it's got that classic head with the jowls that you would associate with the earlier Daddy Hollies.
Crawl.
What's that? Yep.
That crawl thing on it.
Yep. Now here's a Jim Holly decoy. This is up here. This is a bird from the Spasucha Island Rod and Gun Club, which is on the proving ground. And then here's I don't have this one with me, but this is original paint a little bit later, but you can see they're a little more consistent in the way they look even from the side view. Next slide. Now, if you look at them this way, you can see how consistent these are and how consistent these are from the top view down. Even though I don't necessarily use that as a Jim Holly identifying factor, but it does help because there are a little bit of differences. Some of his later birds have more of a rounded tail than this is a little bit pointier. But at any rate, you can see the difference. These are more of a teardrop shaped pattern versus this is a thing to look for with the Daddy Hollies. You've got this little bit more accentuation of the tail, and that's a little bit off there. You can't quite see it as good, but it's the same thing. And again, they're up here on the table, and you can actually handle them and check them out for yourself. Next slide. As I said, they show some variation on the James T. Holly, but not as much as the Daddy Hollies. But again, top down, you can see that you can tell the difference. And this is likely due to Jim Holly. You know, he likely studied under his father at some point, although I don't think it was as early as a lot of people would like to think. You know, another reason for the style differences is Daddy Holly, if he was carving from the 1830s on, I mean, his kids weren't born until, you know, the late 1840s into the 50s. They likely weren't going to be working in the shop until the 1860s. I mean, they may have been in there fooling around, but they weren't doing anything serious in the shop in terms of making decoys. So that means you had to have helpers, you know, and or apprentices. A helper being just a guy, you know, doing minor things. An apprentice, someone who's learning how to be a decoy carver in their own right. And, you know, that probably has something to do with some of the style changes. But that's a big deal because, you know, everybody just assumes, and that goes back to the conversation about how prolific a decoy carver he was. He was making a lot of decoys, and there's no way one guy who was also a fisherman, taking care of his family, doing all that stuff, was making all these decoys by himself. He had to have help. And guys like Dick Hallett, he probably worked in his shop, and he probably learned the trade from him and picked up a lot of the stylistic things that Daddy Holly was doing. The decoy that's in the museum now that Chad has, it's not the same. So whenever you hear somebody say that's a Dick Hallett, take it with a grain of salt, because I don't think we'll ever know for sure, other than that one decoy, what a Dick Hallett looked like.
They were all the same vintage and all that, right?
Well, I think that one that's in there, Chad's probably 1880s, 1890s. Courier got it when he was a young man. It was in Hallett's rig, so probably that vintage.
Do they know any other names of the people that may have worked in his shop?
Yeah, this is my opinion. There was a guy named William Dobson, and does the name Dobson ring a bell for anybody that's like a waterfowl history buff? Anybody ever heard of Jess Poplar?
Yeah.
Jess Poplar's middle name is Dobson. Dobson Poplar. Dobson, I have newspaper articles from the 1880s. That guy was considered people, Mike Daly and I will argue about this, but that guy in one day shot over 500 canvasbacks by himself from a sink box rig on the flats. Wow. Over 500 using 2 guns, muzzle loaders. You know.
Wow.
Yeah, he wasn't using automatics, so that'll give you an idea of how prolific that guy was. And there's a newspaper article about him, talks about that, and then it talks about it. They interviewed him, and he said from the time he was a little kid, if he was not gunning, he was making decoys. So there's a lot of decoys out there that I believe were made by guys like Dobson that we don't have any idea. But that the time frame is right that guy would have probably worked in Daddy Holly's shop. and it's pretty cool. He was a Civil War vet, ended up dying destitute, was in a veterans home, and I believe he's buried in Virginia. But yeah, guys like that are examples of guys that most people have never heard of that were probably pretty significant decoy makers. Another observation about Jim Holly decoys, can you go back a slide? One more. Sorry about that. If you look at Daddy Holly decoys, the heads are very rounded at the top, even on the canvas backs, but Jim Holly's have a more pronounced crown, and that's another identifying factor in discriminating between the two. Okay, you can go forward again. Thanks. So before we take questions, I think I'm doing pretty good on time, aren't I, Bert? Go next slide. Next. Okay, here's a final comparison that's really cool. Again, I said very few Daddy Holly decoys are found in original paint. And it's Gary treated y'all to something really cool. He's got one of the best Daddy Holly decoys I've seen up here. I happen to have a rig mate to it. It's the same. It's got 1820 branded in the top of the head, and it's in original paint, and it's very early. I think it's probably 1840s, so about as early a Daddy Holly as you'll ever see. And that I got into this already, but and this I was talking about my decoy here, and thanks for bringing the prop, Gary, because it's same birds. But
I could have brought you one of those too, and I almost did because I wanted you to idea that Kosh or Nod or whatever.
Right. So when I flip the slide, you're going to see one that was gunned on Lake Koshkonong. But that bird, I know for a fact it was gunned out there because it's branded T.A. Logan. He was a known gunner out there, and he was an attorney from Ohio, and I think he was like a state's attorney in, if not Ohio, Illinois. I mean, he was originally from Ohio, but he was also a writer. He did sporting writing, and he wrote under the pen name Glone. He did a book on rifles and things like that. But what's unique about this is it's got the same wing pattern as the earlier decoy. Go ahead and flip the slide. So here's Gary's got an identical bird on the table. And if you look, this wing painting is wild. It's very detailed. It's actually got the primaries painted out here. It's not like your typical upper bay paint that you would see. And it comes up here and kind of comes around like that. Now look at the worn paint patterns on this bird, which is obviously a later style. Same paint patterns, and that's original paint that's just been worn down. This one had the neck blown out, but what's cool about it, and I don't know if you can see it because of the lighting, but every Daddy Holly decoy I've had x-rayed has a reinforcing nail that was driven into the head from the bottom as to strengthen the neck, and they're always cut nails. Maybe a few later examples you might see a wire nail in there, but they're all cut nails. And this one just happens to expose that and show it without an x-ray. But I thought that was really cool because these are the only birds I've ever seen with that paint pattern. And again, we don't know what was on there because most of them were repainted, 15, 20, 30 times over the course of their life. And who knows how many we never got to see because they ended up in a wood pile, in a fire, or in a wood burning stove. So now I'll take questions.
I got a question.
Yep.
I noticed there's a lot of kind of iron keels on these Daddy Hollies. Do they think there was a guy that made iron keels for people and they bought them, or did local blacks maybe make them?
Local blacksmiths were making them.
Varied from
I mean, you'll see the horseshoes. I have this.
I've had something like that.
This Carroll's Island branded. This is an early hen canvasback, and that's an actual horseshoe that was cut into a keel.
Well, that's neat. And
they just sharpened them. And if you look at these up here, there's a bunch of different ones up here. And I'd be glad if people want to come up and look at these. There's a few birds up here that are really kind of special, and you can't see them in the dark, so we could talk about them in the light, but pretty unique. And I've got some redheads here too, where you can see the differences in those as well. But Chad wants me to do a examination of keels and write an article about it. And I'm like, Chad, you're killing me. I mean, measuring the birds is, but trying to get something from looking at the keels. I mean, there may be some kind of thread that goes through that, but I'm trying to talk him off that project.
I couldn't tune into the measurement thing that Evans McKinney did.
Right.
Because, so many of the things were hand chopped. I mean, it's good to vary. And
they're all hand chopped.
I couldn't understand why he was so in depth on those measurement things.
Well,
did you ever meet him?
No, I did not.
I met him, but we never got into that kind of thing. Talk-wise.
Well, I think there's again, I wrote an article for when we put this into the museum. There's back issues of this available at the museum, and if you're not a member of the Havre de Grace Museum, I'm sure there's very strong opinions in here about what happened at the War Museum. But this is it, folks. This is the only show in town for us now, and I'm on the collections committee. We're trying to do good things up there. We'd appreciate your support. And
it is unbelievable. I hadn't been there in like 10 or 15. I could not believe the place. It's awesome.
This magazine itself is worth the price of a membership. I mean, Mike Tarquini's done a great job with it, but I've got, you're welcome to look at this, Gary. I've got some measurements in there and of all those decoys.
Wouldn't they use in sizes because whatever blocks of wood they had, they would cut a decoy out, and that's why you could buy small ones, big ones, in the middle ones.
I'm glad you brought that up because I haven't been using my note cards and I had a bunch of notes, but they're out the window now. So these guys were not rich guys. They were common folk. I mean, we look at these as folk art now. These guys were just trying to make a living, and they didn't have money. They were using whatever they had available to make these decoys. And what they would do is down the river would come these timbers. You had rafts of timbers coming down from the upper Susquehanna. You'd have a storm, or the ice flows would come in the wintertime, and all this wood would get scattered, and that's where they got their wood from. So they weren't getting wood from a mill and having it milled to specification. They were using what they had. So that accounts for some variation too, because I've got an order for 100 decoys, and I've got this wood. I might have to adjust my pattern to accommodate getting that many blocks out of that wood that I have.
I mean, a real perfect example is Courier.
Is what?
Jim Courier.
Yeah.
There are Jim Courier decoys in 50 different sizes.
Right. And he was one of the few guys that continued hand chopping in the contemporary era. But he could go to a mill and get wood. He didn't have to go out on the river and collect it.
You never see these decoys split either. They have good wood. They need to pick wood.
Right, and some of the other variation, remember, they could be old barn timbers, they could be, just old logs. Right, a lot of them were already used, old growth timber, but they might have pegs in them, because they were a part of a barn, whatever. So some of the variation you may see will be working around imperfections. I mean, some of them left that stuff in there depending on where it was on the block, and you'll find, decoys that have old plugs in them and stuff like that because they were used in a barn at some point. So that's a variation as well. That was a good question.
Has any patterns ever surfaced that these guys use? Able to find any of that kind of stuff?
I'm unaware of any. There may be somebody with Jim Holly stuff. Because Jim Holly died in 1935, so he was the last one to go. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because when you hear William Holly made this decoy or John Jr., that's a stretch, because we really don't have any definitive proof that there's hand-me-down stuff that, hey, they finished out Daddy's orders, and they may have, and I'm sure they worked around the decoys, and they may have done that because Jim had his own business, but they were painters and wallpaper guys, so that wasn't their main business. So it's hard to make any kind of real attributions to those guys. So if you see a decoy that doesn't really fit Jim, or or daddy, it's best to just say Holly family. It could be them, but we don't know for sure.
Yeah, it's a tough call.
Yeah, yeah.
Kevin, you mentioned the reinforcement nail in the head. Where was that driven in from? Was that driven into the head before it was attached? Or was it
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Before the head was applied to the body.
From the bottom,
From the bottom. Yep.
from the neck.
And that's, there's not a lot of space there, because you had to drill the hole down from the top to actually put the long spike down into the body. Any other questions?
So you're saying he ran 2 nails, one from the top and one from the bottom?
Correct.
Okay. And then was it toenailed around the neck?
Yes, 2 nails in the neck.
Okay.
Yeah. Everyone I've x-rayed has had that. Every daddy I've x-rayed's had that reinforcing nail. Yep.
And there were cut nails from the top also?
No, it was usually like a spike. I don't know that it was actually a nail, could have been a long nail that they clipped the head off of, a wire type nail, or they could have specced out with a blacksmith, hey, I want these long spikes. But no, very few that I've seen that had heads on the nails. They were just a long spike.
Have you identified the filler that they would use? Lead?
White lead. Yep. Yep. Any other questions? And I will note that, I've x-rayed a lot of decoys, and that reinforcing nail is more common across Upper Bay decoys than you would expect. Jim Courier did it. Every Courier decoy that I've x-rayed, particularly the high heads, have a reinforcing nail, and many other makers that, we just don't know because people haven't been x-raying them. So it was more common than you would think.
There's quite a few areas on the East Coast, like up in the mid to upper, where they had nails going up through the bottom.
Right, right. But the daddies were, all the ones I've x-rayed are all cut nails. Any other questions? Well, I appreciate your time. I know this isn't necessarily the subject matter of this club, but thank you. Schick rig birds. Well, here's a Daddy Holly canvasback that was from the Carroll's Island Club. It's branded Carroll's Island, but it's also branded with the J. Schick brand. And my personal opinion is that John Schick, he was a gunner. He owned a bar on Eastern Avenue in Fells Point. I've got newspaper articles identifying him. He was a hunter, no doubt. He used to go hunting deer in West Virginia every year, and he had a venison dinner in his bar every year when he came back from a hunting trip. I also have an ad from 1892 where he's given a reward for a lost Chesapeake Bay dog. So the average person didn't have a Chesapeake Bay retriever unless they were a hunter. So he was definitely a hunter. But I don't think he carved the decoys. Right. He was a German immigrant. He lived in Fells Point. That whole area was German immigrants. And I believe the maker of the Schick birds was a German immigrant, and he probably worked in the shipbuilding trade. I've handled more Schick birds by the maker of the Schick rig without a brand than I have with the brand. So there are some folks that believe that John Schick was the carver, but I don't think there's any water in that. I think he was just a gunner. But remarkable works of art. They're awesome decoys. Awesome decoys, but pretty unique because I've never seen a Schick brand on any other decoy than one of those by that maker.
Kevin, you said you do like doing research. Do you have any knowledge of Daddy Holly's parents, like when he came to the United States or anything like that?
That was a joke. I don't get into the genealogy is cool to a point, but when you get into 4 generations back, there may be a clue in there to something somewhere, but I generally just like to stick to the immediate family, and unless there was a known carver before that you could gather something from. But I don't have any knowledge on that. I think Mike Daly may have gone back, but I think
It's
That-
in Mike Daly's book.
Yeah, the lineage, I think it ends rather abruptly, though.
It goes back to Europe.
Yeah. So here's a pretty unique decoy. This is a canvasback. And if you look at this is a Daddy Holly. When you look at it from that side profile, it doesn't immediately give you the Daddy Holly vibe. But when you go like that, you can see it. But what's really unique about this bird is that this is from Thomas J. Hayward's rig, gunned on the Bush River on their properties up there, the Bartlett and Hayward rig. And it's the only canvasback I've ever seen out of that rig. All the other birds are redheads. So it's pretty unique.
I think I actually owned that at one time.
Did you?
I know right where I bought it, too. I bought it at Crumpton.
It's a very cool bird. This was on the slides. This is a hen canvasback, I believe, 1850s, and that's branded with the Carroll's Island brand there, and that's got that horseshoe weight. And it's this line tie is really cool because where it's sat on the staple, rusted. There's barely any metal left there. It's pretty neat. But a really old, worn bird. Here's the classic Daddy in original paint. This whole bird was painted orange. I think some hippie must have had it out on their front porch or something, but it came down and all the original paint was still there. Pretty neat. And different wing patterns than that what I showed you earlier on those real early birds.
Hey, Kevin, to tell a story about Carroll's Island. When back in my early days of traveling and looking for decoys over in Essex, Maryland, Eastern Avenue, on the, I guess it's Middle River. I was riding around just looking, and I saw this waterfront shack with 500 crabs.
You get locked up for that stuff today, Joe.
500 crabs to sit down. And I saw a little shed with some decoy heads, like grabbed a man's door, and he invited me in. And in his kitchen, he had a shelf that went around his entire kitchen. And the entire shelf was Daddy Holly decoys. And we started to take them down, and every one had Carroll's Island brand hens and drakes. And he had a gimbaled coffee pot about this big, and it had Carroll's Island Gun Club 18 something or other. The date was on there. That first prize for shooting. And dumb me, I forgot where the man lived, so I never did get back there, and he never did sell me anything. But there was a whole wall full of Carroll's Island Daddy Holly.
It might be still in the family because I haven't seen a large amount of those come to auction.
It was 20 or 25 of them, at least.
Yeah, the legend was that they had a fire where they stored the decoys down there, and that they were all destroyed. Other than a lot of these birds that you find were drifters that cut out of the like that chick bird. I'm sure that thing broke away and drifted down and was picked up, and he had that branded with his rig mark on it. But yeah, Carroll's Island is a pretty special place.
Yeah.
It really got me hooked when I got to gun out there. It's a cool place. Not the same duck shooting as it once was, but it's still, when it's good, it's pretty good. This is a close to Carroll's Island Daddy Holly redhead, and it's probably you can't see it here, but it's got this unique copper hunter's repair on both sides of the neck that's pressed into the wood. But this was from the Edwards rig, George Albert Edwards, Frogmortar Creek down in Bowley's Quarter. Had a big rig of decoys. John knows his grandson, as do a few other folks in here. But I got to be friends with his grandson. He had a lot of great stories. They gunned an island called Spry Island, which is just off of Carroll's Island, and it's now a shoal. A hurricane just wiped it out. But they loved gunning redheads, and they had some great birds in their rigs. I mean, priors and hollies and you name it, lockers. And they're all repainted as redheads. These guys like to gun redheads. So anyway, that's a really neat bird. Here's a early Jim Holly in original paint that's worn, a redhead hen. And this has got that really classic bulbous nose redhead profile to the head. Just a really neat bird. The Jim Holly canvasback from the Spasush Island Rod and Gun Club. That's a stone's throw from where I work right now, and in a really neat place as well. And I gun that a lot, and the gunning there is really good, and it's just a really neat place. Unfortunately, the great mansion that stood on that property was destroyed in the early 70s, but it was there's pictures of it. That was the clubhouse out there. And that club was all New Yorkers. It was incorporated in 1892. J.P. Morgan was a member there. Just the who's who of financial titans in this country in that era. Jackie Kennedy Onassis, she was an Auchenschloss. I think I pronounced that right. But I think Hugh Auchenschloss was a member of that club, so just a lot of money there. And here's probably the coolest. There's only one other of these known, at least that I know about, and John Sullivan has, and it's in the Decoy Museum, but this redhead with this real pointy tail on it. And this was from John Fletcher Wilson's rig. He was a canner from Havre Grace, and if you've been to Havre Grace, the cannery antique store, that was his cannery. And I don't know whether he spec'd these out, because I can't imagine this being a one-off where there was a knot or something that needed to be carved out. So I'm thinking that for whatever reason, he made a rig of these in this style. And this was identified as a unknown upper bay body with a Bendai head on it. But that's 100% Daddy Holly. And really cool. And that's it. I mean, you're all welcome to come up and check them out and handle them. And I appreciate your attentiveness and the invite from the Delmarva Club, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I was stationed all over the country.